My name is Danielle. I'm 65 years old. And last month, I found out my son got married by accident. I wasn't invited. I didn't even know it happened. And when I asked his new wife why, she looked me right in the eyes and said, only special people were invited. That moment changed everything in my life. Before I tell you the full story, tell me, where are you watching from? And make sure to subscribe for more stories about family drama and emotional courage. I still remember the exact sound the trash bin made when I opened it that morning. A soft, hollow clunk. Ordinary, familiar, nothing that should have made my heart race the way it eventually did. I've lived in my little Ohio house for nearly 20 years, and mornings usually follow the same gentle pattern. Coffee brewing, radio humming low, and me tidying up the kitchen before taking out the garbage. It was supposed to be just another quiet Tuesday. I wasn't expecting anything unusual. I certainly wasn't expecting my life to split into before and after with the lift of a trash can lid. And I wasn't expecting to discover something that would make me question how well I truly knew my own son. I walked down the driveway with a Tide bag of kitchen waste, still warm from the breakfast dishes I had rinsed moments earlier. The air was crisp but pleasant, the kind that reminds me how much I enjoy simple routines. Routine feels safe at my age, reliable, predictable. But the moment I opened that trash bin, predictability walked right out of my life. The first thing I noticed was an envelope, larger than the usual mail, with a soft ivory color and a gold shimmer that caught the sunlight. It wasn't dirty, as if someone had placed it gently on top instead of tossing it carelessly. At first, I thought it might have blown in from a neighbor's recycling, so I picked it up to check the name. That's when everything in me froze, because the name printed across the front wasn't mine. It wasn't the neighbor's. It wasn't a stranger's. It was my son's, Ethan Miller. My Ethan, my only child. I blinked twice, thinking I was making a mistake. I whispered his name out loud, as if hearing it would somehow make the situation easier to understand. But there it was, in fancy, cursive, elegant, and unmistakable. Confused, I slid my thumb under the flap and opened it. My first thought was maybe it's a thank you card or something from a friend of his. The envelope felt heavy, though not like a normal card, the kind of weight that makes you expect something important inside. Inside was something I had never imagined I'd see this way. A wedding invitation. A beautifully designed one. Thick cardstock, gold lettering, soft floral corners, and the unmistakable headline. Together with their families. Only I wasn't listed. Not as mother of the groom. Not as a guest. Not at all. My eyes scanned the details twice, then a third time, hoping I had somehow misread it. The ceremony was already over. 3 weeks ago. 3 whole weeks. I felt a strange ringing in my ears, like I had stepped underwater. My hands began to shake, and I had to set the card against my hip just to steady myself. I reread the names, my son's name next to a woman I had only met twice in my life. Her name printed in soft pink ink, as if it were the sweetest thing in the world. I stared at the date, not believing it. The weekend of the wedding. That was the same weekend Ethan had told me he was going on a work retreat. I remember wishing him a safe trip, telling him to take pictures, asking him if he needed me to watch his cat. He had smiled and hugged me. He had lied straight to my face. A sudden heaviness pressed into my chest, the kind that makes your breath come shorter and your eyes sting. I sank down onto the small step near the garage, still holding the invitation like it was a piece of evidence in a crime. The world around me felt frozen, even though nothing had actually changed except what I now knew. Kids on bicycles passed on the sidewalk. A dog barked somewhere down the street. A delivery truck rumbled past. Everything was normal, but I wasn't normal anymore, because my son, My own flesh and blood got married without telling me, without inviting me, without even giving me the dignity of a heads up. I sat there longer than I want to admit, blinking against the sting in my eyes, trying to swallow the mix of hurt, confusion, and disbelief climbing up my throat like a rising tide. Then something else inside the envelope slid out, a small folded card addressed to Ethan and Caroline. I unfolded it. It was a handwritten note. Thank you again for choosing us to capture your special day. Your backyard ceremony was beautiful, intimate, and full of love. We hope you cherish these photos forever. Backyard ceremony? My heart clenched. My son had a wedding close enough for me to attend, but didn't want me there. Not even in the background. Not even across the yard. Why? What had I done? I sat with that question for a long moment, feeling it settle in my bones. I thought about every conversation over the last few months. He had grown distant, yes, but I blamed work stress. He had canceled a couple of dinners with me, but he always apologized. He introduced us to his girlfriend, Caroline, only briefly, but I assumed they wanted to take their time. Not once did he mention engagement. Not once did he mention wedding plans. Not once did he mention family involvement. And now I knew why. He never intended for me to be there. The invitation wasn't addressed to me. It wasn't meant for me. But it found me anyway, because he threw it away. I slowly stood up and brushed off my pants, the cold invitation still in my hand. The trash lid swung shut behind me, echoing like a final, painful punctuation mark. Inside my house, the silence felt different. Too heavy, too aware of me. Like even the walls understood something irreversible had happened. I set the invitation on my kitchen counter and stared at it like it might explain itself. But it didn't. It just sat there, pretty and cruel. I walked to the living room, sat on the edge of the couch, and picked up my phone. The screen lit up. His contact photo stared back at me. My son's smile, taken last summer at the park, when things felt normal, when I still believed I was a part of his life. My thumb hovered over the call button. I didn't press it. I wasn't ready to hear him pretend everything was fine. Instead, I whispered to the quiet room. "Why didn't you want me there, Ethan?" My voice cracked. No one answered. After an hour or so, I picked up the invitation again, and that's when I noticed something I had missed earlier, a small tear on the envelope flap, as if someone opened it in a hurry, as if someone didn't care to keep it neat. Why would he throw it away instead of keeping it? It didn't make sense. Weddings are meant to be treasured. People save invitations as keepsakes. Why toss it out like trash? Unless he didn't want me to ever find it. My heart dropped at the thought. I tried to push the idea away, tried to believe this was all a misunderstanding, but even as I attempted to talk myself down, something inside me whispered that this wasn't accidental. Someone made sure I stayed out of that wedding. But who? My son? Or her? The second possibility stung deeper than the first. I didn't know Caroline well. We barely talked. She always seemed polite in that stiff surface-level kind of way. But there was something in her eyes, guarded, calculating, that I noticed during our brief meetings. Something that made me feel like I was being evaluated, not welcomed, not embraced, just measured. A chill moved across my skin. The next thing I did wasn't planned. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just needed answers. I grabbed my keys, slipped into my shoes, and drove. But I didn't drive to anyone's house. Not to Ethan's. Not to Caroline's. I drove to the small park near my neighborhood, the one with old picnic tables and big oak trees that have been there longer than I've been alive. It's the place where I go when I need to think, cry, or just breathe without anyone seeing me. I parked under the same oak tree Ethan used to climb when he was a little boy. I could almost hear his childhood laughter around me, a memory that should have brought comfort, but now only deepened the ache in my chest. There, in that quiet spot, I opened the invitation again and stared at every detail. The fonts, the wording, the location, the names, the date. Every piece of it felt like a reminder that I had been erased. I traced my finger across the gold trim and whispered his name again. Ethan. Then, for the first time that day, anger joined the sadness. Not wild anger, not explosive, but a slow, heavy anger that came from feeling disrespected, ignored, and cut out of something a mother should never be cut out of. I wanted to understand. I needed to understand. Because no mother should have to find out her only son got married from a discarded invitation sitting at the top of a trash bin. As the sun shifted behind a cloud, I made a quiet decision, one that didn't feel like revenge yet, but felt like the first step toward reclaiming my dignity. I wasn't going to sit silently. I wasn't going to hide. I wasn't going to be erased. If they thought throwing away that invitation would keep me in the dark, they were wrong. I wasn't done. Not even close. And that was the moment, sitting under that old oak tree, when everything inside me changed. The sun had sunk low behind the oak trees when I finally walked back into my house, the discarded wedding invitation still clutched tightly in my hand. I placed it gently on the dining table, as if it were some fragile artifact that might shatter if handled roughly. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums until every creak of the floorboards or distant car horn feels exaggerated, amplified, almost accusatory. I could feel the tension coiling inside me, a mix of heartbreak, confusion, and something that was slowly turning into suspicion. By the next day, I knew I had to see her. Caroline, my son's new wife. I had met her before, twice in passing at dinner and a few awkward family gatherings, but those encounters had always been polite, careful, and contained. She had always smiled with her lips, but never with her eyes. I had sensed something off, even then, but I had dismissed it as nervousness or perhaps the natural barrier someone feels when meeting a parent for the first time. Now, though, with the truth of a secret marriage staring me in the face, I felt a need to confront her, not angrily, but with clarity, as a mother demanding answers for something she should never have been excluded from. I drove the short distance to her apartment, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, my knuckles white. Every turn I made on familiar streets felt heavier than it should. My mind ran through all the possible scenarios. Maybe she had a reason. Maybe Ethan had asked her to keep me out of it, fearing I would react badly. But even as I tried to rationalize, the doubt lingered, subtle, invasive, and unrelenting. When I rang the bell, the door swung open almost immediately. Caroline was there, impeccably dressed, her dark hair perfectly styled, and her makeup flawless, as though she had been expecting a visitor. She smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that reached her eyes. It was the kind of smile that felt rehearsed, a mask of civility that hid something sharper underneath. "Danielle," she said, her voice light, almost airy, like she had just invited me in for tea rather than confronted me about being deliberately excluded from my son's wedding. "I didn't expect you." I stepped inside, cautiously, my gaze sweeping the small apartment. It was clean, well-organized, the kind of place that seemed meticulously maintained. Not messy, not cozy, just controlled. Every pillow on the couch was perfectly fluffed, every picture frame straightened. There was a sense of order here that felt intentional, almost as if disorder had no place in her life, except perhaps for the lives of others. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I laid the invitation on the kitchen counter, letting the sunlight catch the gold lettering so that it gleamed almost mockingly in her presence. "Ethan, your wedding. Why wasn't I invited?" Caroline's smile didn't falter. She tilted her head slightly, studying me with what I would later recognize as the kind of calculated observation people use when they're sizing up an opponent. "Oh, Danielle," she said softly, her tone almost teasing. "Only special people were invited." I felt a chill run down my spine, a mixture of hurt and disbelief that made it difficult to breathe for a moment. My lips parted, but no words came out at first. I wanted to scream, to demand, to break through the politeness of her facade. But instead, I found myself quietly studying her. There was something in that smile that was deliberate, intentional. She wanted me to feel excluded. She wanted me to understand, in no uncertain terms, that I didn't belong. I picked up the invitation and held it against her. This is my son, my only son. And you," my voice cracked, "you decided I wasn't special enough." Her eyes flicked briefly toward the envelope, but the smile never wavered. "Danielle," she said, her tone almost soothing, "I didn't make the decisions here. I simply followed the plan." "The plan," I repeated, my voice sharper now. Every polite word she spoke was like a thorn digging deeper into my chest. What plan could possibly make it acceptable to keep a mother out of her son's wedding? She tilted her head again, her lips curved in that same practiced smile. "I think it's more about the environment, an intimate, controlled setting. Some people work better in small gatherings. It was important to keep things simple. Only a few very special people. You understand, right?" I stared at her, unable to comprehend how anyone could speak with such calm indifference after deliberately cutting a mother out of a wedding. The words stung, but it was the tone, the casual, unbothered tone, that hurt the most. It was deliberate, manipulative even, and I realized at that moment that this wasn't just about the wedding. This was a statement, a carefully delivered message. For the first time, I began to notice the small details around her apartment that I had ignored before. The framed photographs on the wall were mostly of Caroline herself, sometimes with friends, but never with family. On the bookshelf, there were planners, notebooks, and folders, all meticulously labeled, giving the impression of someone who likes to control the environment completely. And then there was the soft hum of the air conditioning, the faint scent of lavender, the absence of anything personal, lived in, or warm. It was a space designed to impress, not to welcome. Was Ethan part of this? I asked quietly, almost afraid of the answer. Did he want me there? Or was this all your idea? Her smile softened just slightly, but it never reached her eyes. Ethan was happy, she said. He trusted me to handle this part. You know how he is. He doesn't like conflict. He wanted the day to go smoothly. Smoothly. That word lingered in the air. I felt a pang of anger at the suggestion that my absence was a favor for him, some protective measure, when in reality, it felt like erasure. I left her apartment that day feeling a mixture of despair and confusion, my mind racing. I kept replaying every encounter with Caroline, trying to decipher the subtle signals I had missed. The tone of her voice, the way she avoided eye contact when I spoke about Ethan's childhood, the faint superiority in her smile. It all made sense now, but it also raised more questions than answers. Why had my son allowed this? How could he let someone treat me this way? Was he so easily swayed? Or had he truly been convinced that my presence was a problem? Over the next few days, I started noticing other signs that deepened my unease. Friends who had attended the wedding or had heard about it mentioned Caroline's meticulous planning, her insistence that intimate meant excluding family. Some even hinted that she had subtly painted me as overbearing or difficult, leaving Ethan uncertain about whether to include me at all. Every new piece of information I received felt like another thread in a tangled web, and I realized that Caroline's cold smile was just the surface of something far more calculated. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being tested, measured, evaluated like a puzzle to be solved. Every conversation, every polite interaction was a subtle maneuver in a game I hadn't agreed to play. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the invitation in the trash wasn't an accident. It was a message, a carefully crafted signal that my place in my son's life could be dictated by someone else. The thought gnawed at me, keeping me awake at night. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, imagining the day of the wedding that I had been denied. I pictured the flowers, the small backyard setup, the laughter of guests I had never met. And I pictured Caroline smiling her practiced, cold smile, knowing I would never see it firsthand. I began noticing the subtle ways in which Caroline had woven herself into my son's life while simultaneously isolating him from the people who loved him. It wasn't just the wedding. It was the way she spoke to mutual friends, the way she described our family, always with an undercurrent that suggested drama or difficulty. Small, strategic comments that seemed innocent to outsiders but carried a sharp edge when you knew the truth. One afternoon, while walking through the local market, a neighbor mentioned seeing Caroline and Ethan shopping together the weekend before the wedding. They seemed so serious, the neighbor said casually, unaware of how her words cut. Like they were planning something big. Intimate, maybe. Private. I nodded, pretending to be casual, but inside, my mind was racing. Private. Intimate. Exclusionary. Each word added weight to the realization that Caroline's cold smile had been the first indicator of a much larger scheme, a deliberate orchestration to keep me away. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, the invitation spread out in front of me again, and traced the letters with my finger. I thought about Caroline's words, her calm, measured explanations, and her smile that never faltered. I realized that her coldness wasn't just a personal quirk. It was a strategy. Every interaction had been designed to maintain control, to keep me uncertain, to make me question myself and my place in my son's life. I thought about Ethan, about how easily he had gone along with it, how he had trusted her to manage the situation. My heart ached for him, but it also burned with a quiet determination. I knew I had to understand her motivations, her tactics, and the ways in which she had influenced my son. I needed to gather the pieces of this puzzle before I could even begin to confront it. And yet, despite the hurt and confusion, I couldn't stop replaying her smile in my mind. That cold, calculated curve of her lips, the way her eyes remained distant and measured, it haunted me. It raised questions I didn't yet have the answers to, questions about trust, loyalty, and the lengths someone could go to shape the life of the person I loved most. In the days that followed, I found myself observing her more closely whenever I had to interact with her. Every small gesture, every carefully chosen word, seemed designed to keep me off balance. And with each encounter, I felt both a rising anger and a growing resolve. I realized that the smile had been a warning, a signal that the path ahead would not be simple, that understanding and reclaiming my place in my son's life would require more than passive hope. It was clear that Caroline's cold smile was just the beginning, and I was determined to find out why. After the unsettling visit with Caroline, I couldn't stop thinking about every detail she had let slip, every word, every glance, every calculated gesture replayed in my mind like a recording I couldn't pause. My kitchen table, still cluttered with Ethan's discarded invitation, became the command center for my thoughts. I spread it out again, even though I already knew its contents by heart. But this time, it wasn't just grief or anger I felt. It was curiosity tinged with determination. I needed to understand the web Caroline had woven around my son. I needed to know why he had allowed himself to be led down this path. And I needed answers, even if it meant stepping into territory I had never imagined a mother might tread. The first clue appeared almost accidentally. I was scrolling through my phone when a message popped up from an old family friend, someone I had known since Ethan was a child. The tone was casual, but the content cut sharply through my fog of confusion. I saw Ethan the week before the wedding. He seemed tense, something about Caroline stressing him out. I stared at the message, rereading it several times. Tense. Stress. That didn't sound like the boy I knew, the one who used to stay up all night talking about video games or baseball. Something had changed, and I needed to find out what. I decided to start retracing steps. If I couldn't understand Ethan's choices directly, maybe I could reconstruct them indirectly. I revisited the small coffee shop he used to frequent, the one with the faded wooden tables and mismatched chairs. I asked the barista if she had seen him recently, trying to sound casual. She hesitated at first, then leaned closer, her voice dropping. He's been coming in, but he's different. Quiet. Watching someone, maybe. She gestured vaguely toward the street outside. I don't know if it's personal, but he's not himself. That single comment ignited a spark inside me. I began to piece together what could have been happening. Caroline, meticulous and controlled, probably influenced not only his schedule, but also his behavior, his choices, the way he carried himself in public. My son, my kind-hearted, trusting son, might have been trapped in a series of small, almost invisible manipulations, each designed to keep him from questioning the bigger picture. Determined to dig deeper, I reached out to another source, Ethan's cousin, Melissa, who had attended the wedding. I knew I had to tread carefully, so I phrased my questions as curiosity rather than accusation. Did the wedding feel different? I asked gently over the phone. Melissa hesitated, and I could hear her chewing her words. Well, yes, it was very controlled. Caroline had opinions about who should be there, what should happen. Ethan seemed uneasy at times, but he went along with it. That phrase, he went along with it, echoed in my mind. My son hadn't been completely absent from the decision-making. He had chosen, or at least agreed, to follow someone else's lead, someone who wasn't me. The weight of that realization pressed down on me, not as anger, but as sorrow. I started reviewing the limited social media posts I could access. Caroline had posted a series of images that were carefully curated, flowers, decorations, friends laughing together. But there were gaps, subtle omissions that I noticed immediately. Where were Ethan's friends from college? Where were the people who had grown up with him? Even more glaring, where was I? I could see Caroline had deliberately created a narrative that excluded me, presenting a perfect, sanitized version of the wedding without even acknowledging the people who had mattered most to my son. I decided to take a small step further. I contacted the photographer, whose card had been included with the discarded invitation. The photographer was polite but professional, and after some brief hesitation, she confirmed that the ceremony had indeed been a backyard event, intimate and carefully staged. She spoke of Caroline's precision. Every flower, every seating arrangement, every photograph had been planned. And she mentioned something I hadn't considered. Caroline had specifically requested that parents of the groom be optional. The words made my stomach twist. Optional. Not necessary. Not wanted. I could feel the anger rising inside me again, but I tempered it. At this point, I knew that acting rashly would get me nowhere. I needed a clear picture before I confronted anyone. Every small detail, every offhand remark from friends or neighbors, every message, every post, it was a piece of a puzzle, and I had to assemble it carefully. One evening, I revisited the local library, a quiet place I had long loved, to do a bit of research on public records. There, I discovered something else that started to explain the urgency behind Caroline's actions. Marriage licenses, property records, even minor financial documents hinted at Caroline's careful planning, her need for control over the circumstances. She had clearly orchestrated a scenario where she could secure her position quickly, with minimal outside influence. My son hadn't been deceived maliciously, perhaps, but he had been guided, steadied, nudged toward a decision in ways he hadn't fully recognized. As I pieced these clues together, I began to notice patterns in my own interactions with Ethan and Caroline. Phone calls that went unanswered, small excuses about work or social commitments, subtle changes in Ethan's tone when discussing Caroline. Every detail now seemed loaded with significance. I realized that I had been given fragments all along, little signals that something was amiss, but I hadn't recognized them until now. My investigation also brought me into contact with neighbors who had observed the wedding setup. One elderly man, Mr. Thompson, mentioned noticing Caroline directing a group of friends and family, carefully controlling who could enter the backyard, making subtle adjustments to seating, and quietly instructing people to stay within certain areas. He described her as composed, confident, and unyielding, a woman who clearly valued order above all else. I felt a pang of fear, not for myself, but for my son. If someone could shape a wedding so meticulously, what other areas of his life might be similarly influenced? I began documenting everything. Notes in a small spiral notebook, scribbled in my familiar handwriting, became a chronological record of discoveries. Each entry contained names, times, observations, and emotions. I labeled each as a clue. The friend's text, the barista's comment, Melissa's hesitation, the photographer's confirmation. Every detail mattered, no matter how minor it seemed. Then came the breakthrough. While speaking to another acquaintance, someone who had delivered a small gift to Caroline's apartment, I learned that Ethan had expressed discomfort at some point before the wedding. He said he didn't feel ready, the acquaintance recounted, but Caroline told him it had to happen quickly. Something about keeping things simple, intimate, and private. Simple, intimate, private. The same words repeated again and again. They were no longer just descriptive. They were tactical. Caroline's influence was deliberate, systematic, and carefully hidden behind a veil of casual normalcy. Every small word, every phrase, every suggestion had been used to shape the outcome to her vision. And Ethan, trusting as he always had been, had followed along, believing he was making choices when in reality he had been steered. I also noticed another layer. Caroline had subtly altered my perception in earlier encounters. Little comments that seemed innocuous at the time now appeared to have purpose. Remarks about my age, my tendencies to worry, my supposed over-involvement, each word a seed planted to cultivate doubt in my son, to make me appear less ideal for the intimate, curated event she was constructing. Even in her cold smile, I realized there was intention. Every flicker of emotion carefully measured, every pause calculated, and the more I uncovered, the more I recognized how meticulous and cunning this approach had been. It wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. It was strategic. She was sculpting the environment, guiding my son, and subtly eliminating obstacles, whether they were family, friends, or anyone else who might question her plans. I began to follow smaller, subtler threads as well. A comment from a coworker, overheard by chance, hinted that Caroline had been talking about Ethan's childhood experiences in ways that painted him as fragile or dependent. Another friend mentioned that she had expressed concern about certain relatives attending, suggesting potential conflicts or emotional tension. Each clue was a tiny, precise nudge, a whisper that ultimately shaped the larger outcome. Every step I took in my informal investigation deepened my emotional conflict. I felt sorrow for my son, who hadn't fully recognized the dynamics at play. I felt anger at Caroline, whose calculated behavior had isolated a mother from one of the most important moments in her life. And I felt a quiet, growing resolve that I couldn't be passive anymore. These clues were not just pieces of information. They were guideposts directing me toward understanding, toward reclaiming my place, and toward protecting my son from being overshadowed in his own life. I also began noticing the small ways the neighborhood had reacted. People who had attended the wedding or seen photographs posted online whispered to me in passing, offering snippets of insight about Caroline's demeanor, the atmosphere she created, and the careful orchestration of events. One neighbor mentioned the way she subtly discouraged certain people from speaking too freely, the quiet methods of control she employed, the meticulous attention to appearances over substance. Each anecdote added depth to the growing picture I was assembling, a picture of a woman who was undeniably charming on the surface, but whose calculated actions were designed to manipulate, shape, and isolate. By now, my spiral notebook was full. My mind raced constantly, reviewing evidence, replaying conversations, analyzing behavior. Every small clue connected to another. And while it was overwhelming at times, it also provided clarity. I began to feel a sense of empowerment, a quiet strength that came from piecing together the truth. Caroline's cold smile, once simply an affront, had become a symbol, a marker of the layers I needed to understand and the vigilance required to navigate the intricate web she had created. I realized at last that following these clues wasn't just about understanding the wedding. It was about understanding the new dynamics in my son's life, the subtle ways someone could influence the people you love, and the necessity of being vigilant without becoming consumed by rage or despair. And so I continued, slowly, methodically, following the traces left behind by words, actions, and behaviors, clues no mother should ever have to track, but clues I couldn't ignore. For Ethan, for me, and for the truth I had a right to uncover. By the time I set my notebook down that night, my hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of everything I had uncovered. The clues had led me far beyond simple suspicion. They had led me into the edges of truths I didn't want to face, truths that now hovered just outside my reach, waiting for me to acknowledge them. I sat at my kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator blending with the ticking clock on the wall, and I knew I wasn't done. What I had learned so far wasn't enough. Not for me, and not for Ethan. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. Sleep had been shallow, restless, filled with fragments of conversations and images that refused to settle. As I made my coffee, I caught myself watching the steam rise, feeling a familiar heaviness sinking into my chest. I had followed clues like a detective, but now I needed confirmation. Something concrete, something undeniable. I couldn't rely on hints anymore. So I decided to start with the most direct source I could think of, the courthouse. It might sound dramatic, but for me, it wasn't. Public records weren't secrets. Marriage licenses weren't hidden. And if I wanted to understand what exactly had happened, I needed to see the documents myself. I wanted to know when they had filed, how quickly things had moved, and whether anything else had been attached that might explain Caroline's urgency. I drove downtown, the morning sun cutting sharp patterns through my windshield. The courthouse wasn't crowded, but there were enough people moving in and out that I didn't stand out. I moved with purpose, head held high, as if this were something I did every day rather than something I had never imagined myself doing. The clerk at the records office was a middle-aged woman with warm eyes and a sympathetic smile. When I gave her their names, she didn't seem surprised, just efficient. She typed the information into her computer and scrolled for a moment before she printed something and handed it over the counter. "This is the public copy," she said kindly. "Let me know if you need anything else." I thanked her and stepped aside, unfolding the document with steady, deliberate movements. At first glance, everything seemed ordinary, names, dates, signatures. But then I noticed something peculiar. It was the timeline. Everything had been rushed, more rushed than I had ever imagined. They had applied for the license just a few days before the wedding. No preparation time. No planning window. Nothing about it matched the story Caroline had implied about a naturally intimate gathering. The quick timeline wasn't proof of anything on its own, but it nudged something inside me. Another hint that Caroline had been guiding the situation, pushing for speed, making sure decisions were made before questions could catch up. As I studied the paper, I noticed another detail: the officiant's name. I didn't recognize it. I knew many local ministers and notaries, but this wasn't one of them. The name looked almost deliberately unfamiliar, like someone chosen specifically to avoid connections. That, too, left me unsettled. I folded the document, slipped it into my bag, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, and the autumn breeze brushed against my cheek, grounding me. I stood there for a moment, letting the sounds of passing cars fill the silence in my mind. But I wasn't done. The next clue came from a place I hadn't expected: Ethan's workplace. I didn't intend to show up there, but after leaving the courthouse, I found myself driving in that direction almost absent-mindedly. When I reached the parking lot, I sat in my car for several minutes, unsure if I should go inside. I didn't want to seem intrusive. At the same time, I needed to understand what had been happening in my son's life before the wedding. Work was a major part of his world, and I knew his coworkers had probably seen things I hadn't. I finally took a deep breath, grabbed my bag, and walked into the lobby. The receptionist recognized me. Ethan had worked there long enough that I had met some of his colleagues more than once. She smiled politely, but her expression shifted when I asked if she had seen him in the weeks leading up to the ceremony. "Well, yes," she said thoughtfully. "He seemed distracted, and Caroline came here once or twice." She lowered her voice slightly. She seemed protective, very protective, almost like she didn't want him talking to anyone too long. Protective. The word echoed inside me, heavy with implication. I nodded, thanked her, and didn't push further. I didn't want rumors. I wanted facts. And yet, the receptionist's hesitation, the careful choice of words, it all pointed in a direction I could no longer ignore. As I walked out, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Not dramatic, not wild, but off in a way that made my stomach tighten. The truth I was searching for wasn't going to present itself directly. It was going to come through small cracks, subtle inconsistencies, quiet observations from people who had seen glimpses of a reality my son hadn't been willing to share. Driving home, I felt a mix of dread and determination. Every step I took toward understanding seemed to reveal another layer, and I wasn't sure how deep it would go. But I couldn't turn back now. Later that afternoon, I received a message from someone I hadn't heard from in years, Ethan's old high school friend, Jacob. He had seen a picture from the wedding online and reached out with a simple, "Hey, is everything okay? Didn't see you in any of the photos." I stared at the message, my throat tightening. Jacob had been like a brother to Ethan when they were younger. If anyone had a sense of how Ethan normally behaved, it would be him. I replied, "It's a long story. Can we talk?" He drove over that evening. When he walked into my living room, it felt like stepping into the past, back to a time when Ethan was carefree, when I didn't have to decode every detail of his life. Jacob sat on the couch, hands folded, eyes serious. "I'm just going to say it," he began. Ethan didn't look like himself in those pictures. Not unhappy, but off. Stiff. Like he wasn't relaxed. Like he was trying to do everything right. I swallowed hard. "Did he ever mention anything to you about Caroline?" "Only once," Jacob said. "He told me she liked things a certain way. Thoughtful, organized, that kind of thing. But he also said she got upset easily when plans changed." Plans. Control. Precision. Another piece of the puzzle slid into place, quiet but undeniable. Jacob leaned forward. If you think something is wrong, trust your gut. You know him better than anyone. I thanked him, grateful not just for his insight, but for his honesty. As he left, I felt a lump rising in my throat. I didn't want to believe anything was truly wrong. I didn't want to think that my son might be stepping into a life where he didn't feel free to speak up. But the truth was taking shape whether I wanted to see it or not. The real turning point came 2 days later in the most unexpected way. I needed groceries, and as I walked through the aisles of the local store, trying to distract myself with practical tasks, I heard a familiar voice behind me. It was Caroline's neighbor, a woman named Linda. She recognized me immediately and walked over with a friendly smile. "I heard about the wedding," she said. "Congratulations." Her tone was genuine, but I felt a sting as I forced a smile. I wasn't actually there, I admitted. I didn't explain further, but her eyes softened, and she hesitated before speaking. "That explains a lot," she murmured. Confusion prickled through me. "What do you mean?" She lowered her voice. "I probably shouldn't say this, but I heard them talking the week before the wedding. Not arguing exactly, just intense. She kept telling him it needed to happen soon, that people might interfere, that keeping it small was better for both of them." I froze. People might interfere. Better for both of them. The words shook something inside me. They were too direct to ignore, too pointed to explain away. Linda continued quietly. "I've seen her get worked up over small things. She likes control, and he seems careful around her." Careful. That single word broke me in ways I hadn't expected. My son, who had always laughed freely, always spoken his mind, always felt safe being himself around me, careful around someone he loved. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I walked through the store, checking items off my list, but my mind stayed with Linda's words. And as I drove home, the pieces of the truth began to settle into place. The rushed timeline, the selective guest list, the curated photographs, the protective behavior, the quiet tension, the carefulness. It wasn't one thing, it was all of them. Together, they formed a picture of a marriage built not on spontaneity or joy, but on pressure, influence, expectations. Ethan hadn't eloped out of excitement. He had married quickly because someone else wanted it that way. That truth sat heavy in my chest as I pulled into my driveway. I turned off the car and sat there for several minutes, staring through the windshield as the sun began to set. The world looked calm, ordinary, peaceful, but inside me, something had shifted permanently. I finally understood what had been happening. Not in a sensational way, not in a dramatic movie-like twist, but in a quiet, subtle, deeply human way, the kind that hurts even more because it's so believable. Their marriage wasn't built on a moment of mutual joy. It was built on someone's need for control. And my son, unsure how to push back, had gone along. I didn't know what I was going to do next. Not yet. I didn't know how I would confront the truth or what steps I would take to help my son. But for the first time since this all began, I wasn't fumbling in the dark. I had clarity, and clarity, even when painful, is a gift. I sat there for a long moment, the papers still on the table, my hands resting on them as if they carried some kind of weight that needed holding down. The room had gone quiet again, so quiet that I could hear my own breath coming in slow, uneven waves. After everything I learned about their marriage, after every truth that had scraped its way into my heart, there was only one thought circling in my mind. Not anger, not bitterness, just a firm, steady voice inside me saying, "You have to do something, but don't become like them." It was a difficult thought. Revenge usually comes from a burning place. Rage, shame, betrayal. But that fire had gone out inside me. What stayed behind was something colder, quieter, something that made me want to act in a way that healed me, not harmed them. Still, before I could do anything meaningful, I needed clarity. I stood up, picked up the papers, placed them neatly into a folder, and slid it into the drawer. Then I walked toward the window. The late afternoon sun was falling across the yard, turning everything a soft gold. It should have looked peaceful, but my mind was crowded with emotions I couldn't name. I whispered to myself, "This is not about hurting them. This is about saving myself." And that became the direction I moved toward. A small step that changed the direction. Later that evening, I made tea even though I wasn't in the mood to drink it. My hands needed something to do. The steam rose from the cup, curling in slow motions, and I watched it as if it could give me answers. But then something simple happened, something that pushed me into the first step. My phone vibrated. A message from my son. Just 3 words. "We'll talk soon." It was short, almost careless, as if nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't changed for me, as if he wasn't holding secrets that tore into my heart. My fingers tightened around the phone. For a few seconds, I felt that old urge rise inside me. The one that begged for confrontation, for demanding explanations, for shouting until I understood everything. But I didn't give in. Instead, I whispered, "Talking is not the issue. Understanding is." So I didn't reply to him right away. I didn't confront him, accuse him, or fall apart in front of him like I might have done before. I placed the phone face down on the table and let the silence settle. That silence became the turning point. A visit I didn't plan, but needed. The next morning, after a night of restless thoughts, I took my coat, my keys, and nothing else. I didn't want to think. I didn't even know exactly where I was going until my feet carried me to the car, and my hands turned the wheel. When I eventually parked, I realized where I had come. My sister's house. She opened the door with her usual warmth, but her face quickly changed when she saw my expression. "What happened?" she asked softly. I didn't tell her everything. I didn't want to unload all my pain on her shoulders. But I shared enough for her to understand that something had shaken me deeply. She didn't offer advice. She didn't judge. She didn't try to solve anything. She simply said, "Do what brings you peace, not punishment." Her words stayed with me like a gentle echo. I didn't know how revenge and peace could exist in the same space. But deep down, I knew my path wouldn't be about anger. It would be about reclaiming a part of myself I had quietly given away for years, building a plan that wasn't about them at all. For the next few days, I moved through my routine with a quiet thoughtfulness. I cooked, I cleaned, I sat in the garden during the afternoons, feeling the sunlight on my skin. Life had slowed down, but my mind was sharpening with every passing moment. I realized something important. Their mistakes didn't define me. Their choices didn't control me. Their secrets didn't have to break me. If I wanted revenge, it would not be loud or dramatic. It would not involve shouting, exposing, or humiliating anyone. My revenge would be the kind they didn't expect at all. The kind that lifted me up instead of dragging me down. So I began doing small things, tiny acts that helped me take my power back. I sorted through old boxes. I rearranged the living room. I made space, both inside the house and inside my heart. Every drawer I cleaned felt like a step toward letting go. Every item I set aside felt like a weight lifting from my shoulders. I discovered memories I had forgotten, dreams I had pushed aside, and a version of myself that had been silent for too long. One afternoon, while sitting with a photo album, a thought settled gently inside me. Revenge can be choosing yourself. And that became my direction, a conversation I approached differently. When my son finally arrived a few days later, I was ready not for a fight, not for answers, but for clarity within myself. He walked into the house with a tense expression, probably expecting anger. But I surprised him. I greeted him with calmness. We sat at the dining table. The sunlight from the window fell on his face, and for a moment I saw the little boy he once was, the one who used to come to me with scraped knees and innocent eyes. "Mom," he started, shifting uneasily, "I know things must look strange, but I want you to understand." I raised my hand gently. "You don't have to explain everything right now," I said softly. "I'm not here to argue." He blinked, taken aback. "This isn't about blame," I continued. "This is about honesty. For both of us." For the first time in a long while, he listened without interrupting. I didn't accuse him or talk about the papers or the secrets. Instead, I spoke about myself, about the disappointment, the confusion, the sadness, and the hope I still held. My voice trembled only once when I said, "I raised you with everything I had. I only ask for honesty in return." He lowered his gaze, and I could see his shoulders soften. "You deserve that," he whispered. It wasn't a full apology. It wasn't a confession, but it was a beginning. And sometimes beginnings matter more than endings. My revenge became a gift to myself. Once he left, I realized something profound. I didn't want to destroy anything. I didn't want to break their marriage. I didn't want bitterness to swallow me whole. What I wanted was my own life back. So I began doing things I hadn't done in years. I started going for morning walks. The fresh air filled my lungs in a way that felt like healing. The sound of birds, the soft movement of leaves, the distant laughter of children. It all reminded me that life still had warmth in it. I visited old friends I had stopped meeting because I was always busy being available for everyone else. Their smiles, their stories, their gentle teasing, they made me feel alive again. One afternoon, while sitting with two of my closest friends at a small cafe, one of them said, "You look different, light, happier." And I realized she was right. Revenge wasn't about hurting them. Revenge was letting myself shine again. A quiet act that felt like closure. But there was still one thing left, something small but symbolic. I went into my room, opened the drawer, took out the folder with all the marriage secrets, and sat with it one last time. I read everything again, slowly, gently, without the sharp pain I had felt before. This time, I saw it not as a wound, but as a truth I had accepted. Then I took the papers outside to the garden. I didn't tear them in anger. I didn't burn them furiously. I didn't keep them for future use. I tore them into small pieces, quietly, peacefully, and let the breeze carry them away. It wasn't an erasing of the past. It was a release, a soft goodbye to the pain, not to the memories. I whispered as the last piece left my hand, "I'm choosing myself now." The final step of revenge that healed instead of hurt. A week later, when my son called again, he sounded different, gentler, more patient. He asked if he could take me to dinner. I agreed. During that dinner, something shifted. Not between him and his wife, not between their secrets and their truths, but between him and me. He was careful, thoughtful, and more open than he had been in months. At one point, he squeezed my hand and said, "Mom, thank you for not giving up on us." And I realized I never wanted revenge on my son. I only wanted to rebuild what had cracked. My revenge wasn't against him or her. It was against the silence that kept me small, against the hurt that tried to define me, against the fear that said I couldn't stand again. I rose, not by hurting them, but by choosing myself. And in doing so, I reclaimed every part of my heart they never meant to break. As I look back now, sitting by the same window where so many of my worries once gathered like shadows, I realize something I never understood before. Life doesn't fall apart in one day, and it doesn't heal in one day either. Healing comes slowly, the way morning light creeps across a dark room. Quiet, gentle, almost unnoticed, but it comes. And as it comes, it teaches you that strength isn't found in shouting or in proving someone wrong or in demanding answers from people who are not ready to give them. Real strength grows in silence, in patience, in the way you pick up the small broken pieces of your heart and carry them carefully until you learn how to place them back again. I didn't know peace could feel like this, like soft air on a warm morning, like a cup of tea held between steady hands, like the simple comfort of knowing I did not let bitterness take root inside me. I didn't lose myself in the darkness. I found myself in it. I discovered a version of me who could stand up after heartbreak without blaming others, a woman who could face truths without letting those truths decide her worth. My son, with all his flaws and struggles, is still the boy I raised with love, and his wife, with her cold smile and hidden secrets, is still a part of his journey, not mine. I don't have to fight battles that do not belong to me. I don't have to protect people from their own choices. My only duty now is to honor myself with the same tenderness I once offered everyone else. If revenge was ever a path, I walked it differently, softly, quietly, and without harming a soul. My revenge was choosing peace over noise. My revenge was learning to breathe again without waiting for someone to understand me. My revenge was creating a life filled with light, even after someone tried to draw the curtains. And maybe in the end, this is what life wanted to teach me, that letting go is not losing and moving forward is not running away. It is simply stepping into a future where the weight is lighter, the heart is clearer, and the soul finally feels free to rest. Today, as the sun settles gently over the garden outside, I realize I am no longer waiting for explanations, apologies, or perfect endings. I have given myself the ending I needed, one shaped by grace, strength, and quiet acceptance. And that, more than anything, feels like my truest victory.